Newsfirst, Newsline.
Hello there and a very good evening and welcome to Newsline Live here on TV1. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Jayamal Ratnayaka joining you tonight. Today's topic of discussion is the interim budget, or the amendment made to the 2022 budget. Will it help the people's distress? President Ranil Wickremesinghe, in his capacity as the finance minister, presented the amended budget proposal to Parliament yesterday, and thereafter the debate on the budget commenced earlier today as well. To dissect the proposals that have been introduced in this budget, were there any progressive points, what is missing, what not? We have invited to our studios tonight Raj Prabu Rajkulendran, an analyst attached to Verite Research. A very good evening, Raj. Thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Thank you. Good evening.
Raj, let's get straight to the point. I want to talk to you first about the amendment presented by Ranil Wickremesinghe yesterday in Parliament. Most of the people in the government see this as a very progressive bill or a progressive proposal. What sort of provisions that were provided in this are progressive, and what do you believe has the government missed out on?
So to answer your question on what is progressive, Jamal, is that there was a proposal to introduce a national debt management agency. So that looks at the debt problem, and as you know, currently the debt crisis is one of the biggest issues in Sri Lanka. And the debt management agency, we hope, would look into it and make sure that we don't fall into a debt crisis again. And in terms of what's missing, everyone expected to see more revenue proposals in the budget, in the interim budget and the amendment. But I think even the government has realized that and has also hinted that they will have further revenue proposals in the annual budget that is supposed to be presented in November. But they've also increased VAT to 15% VAT rate.
Effective from 1st of September.
Effective from 1st of September. So what that does is that in addition to that, there were other revenue proposals that were introduced in May. And some of them have to be implemented in October. So we are yet to see what those revenue proposals are and if they will be implemented. But what we notice is that Sri Lanka tends to default back to the pre-COVID tax structure. And that is not ideal in this case. Especially given that the economic climate is vastly different. Pre-COVID, we did not have high inflation, we did not have the socio-economic crisis we have now, and we also did not have the debt crisis. So simply reverting back to the pre-crisis tax structure would not solve the problem. But what we need is to have an in-depth analysis to see what we can do for the future and to come up with new tax proposals or to adjust the current tax structure to suit the current economic climate instead of moving backwards.
Yes, carry on.
So to add, for example, one of the proposals that was introduced in the May was to introduce withholding taxes. So that was something that was there and that was abolished. So withholding taxes on interest income at 5%. And that was a final tax. They are planning on reintroducing that again in October. But now currently interest rates are significantly higher than pre-COVID. So to take advantage of the situation, you can introduce withholding tax as a prepayment, not a final tax. And you can introduce that at 10%. Because with the high interest rate, the government has a high interest cost. And to cushion that, you can basically introduce withholding tax on interest income as a prepayment at 10%. And that alone, according to Verite Research estimates, would give you around 165 billion rupees. So those are advantages that you can take with the current climate, and adjusting your tax structure instead of defaulting back is something that we are hoping to see at least in the November annual budget.
Right. You mentioned interest rates, Raj, when you were speaking in your remarks. Interest rates have, like you said, rightly increased significantly. It used to be 10%. Now it's within the boundary of 30%. And according to sources, private sector debt is at 6.5 billion rupees currently. And if we take the difference from 10% to 30%, which is 20%, that would sum up to 1,300 billion rupees. So now we know the private sector will naturally pass on that burden to the consumers of the country. How can you counter this, Raj?
True. So that will generally affect inflation. And in addition to that, there's an electricity tariff increase and water tariff increase, which would all add to inflation. And one way to counter it is to look at why does the government, and one way to counter that is also by the withholding tax, where you can bring in tax revenue that comes into the government, doesn't need to have debt. And another thing that we also advocate for is to bring in PAYE, where you have the personal income, the pay as you earn system on your employment income. So that's a mandatory system that makes sure that the government gets the income tax on employment income.
Yes.
So those are all measures that would make sure that you get the revenue at a very low tax administration cost. So introducing PAYE at the current high rates, at the current low rates and high threshold, would give you around 18 billion rupees. So all of that would give you additional revenue, and which means that the government doesn't have to issue debt or issue treasury bills and bonds to borrow. So all of that would basically help the government to increase its revenue, because currently, as we know, the government's revenue is really low, and we need significant revenue measures to help Sri Lanka's inflation and the rising expenditure as well.
Raj, we have seen successive governments using the tax structure as somewhat of a political tool in the recent past. We saw how former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa slashed taxes, causing a loss of 600 billion rupees in government revenue per year as a result. And successive governments have used reduced taxes as a tool to garner the mandate of the people. How important is it to steer clear from making such populist decisions just so that you can come into power, and how can you basically not involve the financial aspect of the country simply to get votes?
That's actually a really good question. So the tax structure, basically frequently changing your tax structure undermines Sri Lanka's credibility and the trust, because let's say you want to invest, and if you frequently change your tax structure, it means that investors would find it difficult to come and invest because they don't know what the tax structure is going to be. And also it makes tax administration cost a lot higher. So and we've seen this consistently changing. From 2010 onwards, we've changed our tax structure 6 times. And that is significantly changing your tax rates and the thresholds in terms of personal income tax. One way to counter this is to legalize your tax structure through an Inland Revenue Act. And that makes it difficult to ad hocly change your tax structure. So maybe legalizing and bringing the legal system into it, and making sure that you have to legalize your tax structure, and to amend it you need to go to Parliament and make sure that there is a general consensus, would make it difficult to use tax structures as political motives.
Let's talk about social safety nets. We saw how the cost of goods, the cost of living soared in our country. We heard that inflation is around 60% for this month, and many people are suffering across the island. And we saw how kerosene prices shot up from 80 rupees to 300 rupees overnight. However, yesterday's budget amendment did provide certain proposals to support vulnerable communities, the most impoverished segments of our society. Do you believe that they will actually bear fruit if they are implemented in its entirety and effectively?
Sure. So the interim budget basically allocated 46 billion rupees for a social safety net program, and majority of that, around 45%, goes for the Samurdhi payments. The problem with Samurdhi is that it is very ineffective in its intended purpose, that is targeting the poor. So to give you numbers, the Samurdhi system only targets 40% of the poorest, which is quite ineffective.
Yeah.
So at Verite we have a group called the Verite Research Sri Lankan Economic Policy Group, and we look at policy proposals and what we can do to help Sri Lanka's crisis. And we realized the inefficiencies of the Samurdhi system. So what we realized was there is an effective way to target the poor, and that is using electricity consumption. So for example, if you take a cutoff of 60 kilowatts a month, and everyone less than that gets some sort of targeting, some sort of benefit, you can target 80% of the poorest using that method. And it is quite effective, it's quite easier, and you have more realistic, more real-time data. You can have monthly electricity consumption, whereas for Samurdhi you need to wait for the household income expenditure survey. And that's also easier because you can somehow link it to the electricity bill or get it to your phone. So the administration cost is also less. Because for Samurdhi, out of the entire budget it gets, 20%, roughly around 20%, goes for administrative expenses. So that's a waste of money. But this will reduce that administrative cost as well. And in addition to that, it prevents the politicization of Samurdhi. So electricity targeting is clearly an effective way. So we could bring those effective measures, and it's quite easy to implement as well. So instead of using the same old method of Samurdhi to target the poor, we can actually use electricity targeting and use that money, the 47 billion, to target the poor, and that's the whole purpose of a social safety net program. And that will enable us to actually achieve the intended purpose, because like you said, the poor is greatly affected by this crisis, with an inflation not coming down anytime soon. We need social safety measures, but we also need to make sure that the right people are targeted, and electricity targeting is one way of doing that.
So expanding this social safety net means, in other words, that the government will have to channel more money into this segment. How does the government go about getting the revenue required to manage the state of affairs in the country, as well as expanding the social net? Because we saw several proposals. One such proposal presented by the President was 61,000 food insecure families which need urgent assistance will be provided 10,000 rupees per month for 4 months, and then additional monthly allowance of 2,500 rupees for pregnant mothers. So the social safety net is widening, but where do you find the revenue?
So one way is through expenditure reallocation, and we've seen World Bank and many other multilateral agencies, they're reallocating expenditure from other capital projects to help Sri Lanka fund social safety nets. And another way is, like I mentioned earlier, is to implement bring up withholding taxes or other revenue enhancing measures. So another proposal that Verite has is on cigarette taxation. Right. So there was a formula that was there in the 2018 or 19 budget to implement a formula on cigarette taxation. And what our Verite estimates show that by not implementing it, in 2023 you're going to lose 45 billion rupees. And just to give you an example, Samurdhi payments is just 50 billion. So you can almost take your cigarette taxation revenue and direct it to Samurdhi. So there are these easy revenue enhancing measures that the government can do, and the government is in desperate need for those measures. So hopefully we see those in the November budget.
Let's come back to the tax structure in the country. Do you believe that there needs to be significant changes in the tax structure, or does it seem like the government has finally got its act together and they are on the path of reforming the tax structure in the country, which is fair by all segments of society?
So the tax structure needs significant look at, and it also needs a lot of analysis behind it. So for example, you can't have the same tax-free threshold you had in 2019 because of inflation, and we are getting into this wage price cycle where wages are also increasing. So if you're still sticking to your old tax-free threshold, a lot of people whose real wages have not gone up, but in nominal terms their wages have gone up to counter inflation, would fall under higher tax brackets, and they'll have to pay high taxes. So you will need to do that analysis, and that analysis is not something we've seen yet. And that's something that's lacking throughout government policies. The need for analysis is high, and especially in the current crisis. So we need tax policies that have sound analysis behind them, and those are something that we'll have to wait and see if we get those. So once we see those analyses, then we can question if it's the right tax structure or not.
Right. Let's talk about job losses, creating jobs and whatnot. We know, isn't it better for the government to change its monetary policy towards growing the economy and creating more jobs, instead of trying to constrict the economy and controlling inflation? Do you believe this is a viable option the government could explore?
Sure. So the public sector, just to give you a few numbers, the wage bill alone cost the government currently around 76%. Wages and pensions cost the government around 76% of its revenue. And also Sri Lanka is one of the largest public sectors. When you look at South Asian countries, in Sri Lanka, around 18% of the total employed is in the public sector. So Sri Lanka has a bloated public sector and also the high wage bill. So what Sri Lanka actually needs is, in order to create these job opportunities, it needs to make sure that it has enough revenue to make those payments, because we hear news where Sri Lanka doesn't even have money to pay existing salaries and wages. So Sri Lanka needs to, as I keep saying, Sri Lanka needs to focus on making sure it has enough revenue to create all of these opportunities for the people.
Right. We are in conversation with Raj Prabu Raj Kulendran. He is an analyst attached to Verite Research. We are dissecting the points of the budget amendment bill that was proposed yesterday in Parliament. However, we must now cross over for tonight's headlines. See you on the other side.
Newsfirst, Newsline.
Welcome back. We are in conversation with Raj Prabu Raj Kulendran, an analyst attached to Verite Research. Raj, I want to ask you a question on the targets of governments. I was reading a report released by Verite Research where the 2021 budget proposals that were presented were only 6% of the allocated proposals were fulfilled by the government, which means only 6% of the promises that they made through that budget were fulfilled. So do you think governments are making realistic targets, or are these just to appease the people?
Yes, so what we see, Jamal, is that the government, like you said, is only 6%, there are only 6% of the proposals that was fulfilled. And what's scary is that in this interim budget and the next annual budget, is this trend going to continue? Because what we've seen is, even in the past, we don't have a majority of fulfilled promises. And one reason could be is that we have over-optimistic revenue targets. Since 2009, this is how far we have the data, but even before that, Sri Lanka has never met its revenue targets. And Sri Lanka has over-optimistically estimated its revenue. And because of that, because where there is little revenue, Sri Lanka has two options. Either it can reduce on its expenditure, or will have to take a bit of debt. So Sri Lanka, I think, would do a bit of both. And that could be one reason why we see a fall in promises. However, these budgets that are going to come in November and the current budget have a lot of social safety nets in it. So if those promises are not met, it could significantly impact the poor. And with rising prices and all of that, it could diminish their ability to purchase goods and even survive. So that implementation is a problem. We also see that certain proposals, they don't move forward. There's no action plan. So you can have high-level proposals, but there is no action plan. There's no step-by-step procedure. Essentially a blueprint to carry out the proposals, and which is why they're left unfulfilled. So those are a couple of reasons why, and we hope to see that those are structural issues that need to be addressed, and we hope that those will be addressed in the future.
Raj, speaking about over-optimistic revenue targets, you know, traditionally Sri Lanka has been known as a very attractive tourist destination. Tourism has been a very big revenue earner for Sri Lanka. However, after COVID-19 happened and the economic crisis that ensued, tourist arrivals dropped drastically, and there seems to be a resurgence of tourism once more. And however, the president himself has said that he envisions Sri Lanka being transformed into an export-led economy. So do you believe Sri Lanka should transition from a country that earns its money through tourism to producing its own goods and whatnot, and basically give tourism a backseat? I'm not saying do away with it completely, but stop relying on tourism so much and move into other sectors to generate income?
True. So tourism, and we see this narrative throughout where people say that tourism is going to bail Sri Lanka out, and once tourism recovers, Sri Lanka will be out of the crisis. And there are a few issues with that, and I would say it's not safe to rely entirely on tourism to bail Sri Lanka out of the crisis. The biggest reason is that we don't know how much we are getting from tourism. We see numbers that say that we got 4 billion in 2019 or 2018. Those numbers are estimates, and they are not actuals. So the estimates, how that happens is that they have a survey at the airport from tourism and from tourists, and through that survey they get the numbers and they publish. But when you compare with your regional peers, Sri Lanka says basically a tourist who comes to Sri Lanka spends around $180 per day. But when you look at India, they say that the tourist only spends 120, and Maldives spends even less. So that begs the question, is Sri Lanka over-optimistically overestimating its tourism earnings? Because why would tourists spend more in Sri Lanka as opposed to India or other countries? So that's a question that we need to answer. The second is that even at high levels of tourism in 2018-19, we still ran current account deficits. We still had to borrow, which means that if tourism recovers in the near future, it will not create a surplus. We still need to borrow. We still need access to financial markets to borrow, because that was the trend earlier. We see no reason that it will change now. So relying on tourism to bail you out will not be realistic, because you still had to borrow in the past with high levels of tourism. The third is that with the COVID crisis, there was no inbound tourism. At the same time, there was no outbound tourism as well. So when tourism recovers, as much as tourists come in, tourists go. Sri Lankans also leave the country. For example, in India, in 2017, 18, and 19, the number of Sri Lankans who visited India were greater than the number of Indians who came to Sri Lanka. And that means that there's a significant outflow that was stopped in terms of foreign currency due to the COVID pandemic. And that could also resurge once tourism recovers. So those are three main reasons why you should be skeptical on relying entirely on tourism. That does not mean that you should not develop tourism sector. So the tourism sector does contribute to Sri Lanka's foreign exchange earnings and should be developed, as Sri Lanka is a great potential and has a lot of potential to develop tourism. But relying on tourism to bail out of the current crisis we have is questionable.
So if tourism is not the answer, what sort of industries have the potential to grow to such an extent that they could be great foreign exchange earners to Sri Lanka? Do you have an idea on what they could be?
So one sector we've seen a lot of growth and has been contributing to a lot of export earnings is the garment sector. The garment sector was growing in Sri Lanka, but due to the current crisis, we see a lot of orders moving out. We see news where orders are moving out to other countries. So developing the garment sector could be very significant. In addition to that, the IT sector in Sri Lanka is quite growing as well, and IT sector also allows individuals to outsource to other countries as well. So you can work for foreign firms from Sri Lanka in itself. So those are sectors that could be focused, that Sri Lanka could focus on for improving its foreign exchange.
Moving forward, we know that we are in discussions with the IMF to enter a bailout program, the extended fund facility, and talks are ongoing to reach a start-level agreement. Once all of this is in place, and let's say we do get the allowances that the IMF releases, how can the government ensure that all of these funds are put into good use and Sri Lanka does not end up in a dire situation like this once more?
That's actually an important question, and one way Sri Lanka can ensure that that doesn't happen is through transparency. So the staff level agreement, so far how it has been done is that once we agree with all the targets and once we sign the agreement, that's when it's made public by the IMF. So by then it's too late for public scrutiny. There's no debate over it. Even the annual budget, right? The budget is for 1 year, and we debate it extensively in Parliament. The EFF program essentially puts targets that restricts the budget for the next 4 to 5 years, but we don't debate it in Parliament. There is no transparency over it, and it's not something that's new. There are countries that have legislation that say that you need parliamentary approval before you can get into an agreement with the IMF. Argentina is one, Tunisia is one, Malaysia is one. And what we see is that the best case study we can is Argentina. In 2018, they entered into a standby agreement. That was the largest standby agreement by the IMF itself. It was 45 billion. But what happened was that program was a failure, and it led to Argentina defaulting for the 9th time. We know Argentina is a serial defaulter. And IMF did a post-evaluation, and they realized that there was no ownership over the program, and the program was heavily politically motivated instead of focusing on the country. And as a response to that, Argentinians have had a legislation passed that said that all IMF programs need to be approved by the parliament, the House of Representatives in their country. And that ensures that there's transparency. That ensures that there is debate about it. There's public debate. That also ensures that realistic targets are set, because people question, and realistic targets are set. Because Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF 16 times, and 7 out of the 16 times we have not completed the program. So there is no guarantee that we're going to complete this. and majority of the, and out of the 7 programs, we had 16 programs, we had 3 EFFs, and we completed only 1. And this time also we're going to get into an EFF. So it's very crucial that we set realistic targets, and it's very crucial that we set policies and conditions that will ensure that Sri Lanka gets out of the crisis and also doesn't get into another crisis in a few years. So transparency and making sure that there is visibility over the conditions agreed is one way where Sri Lanka can ensure that it sticks properly and people question about it. And also we see that IMF conditions can be questioned by Parliament, and that will also be questioned by think tanks and other organizations, which will help Sri Lanka also, which will help us and the public to produce analysis on it. We can have stronger policies. So that is one way where we can help making sure that the IMF targets are set, and they're also helping Sri Lanka.
Let's talk about the IMF conditions. It is a tough pill to swallow. It's a panacea, but it seems like a very sour medicine that Sri Lanka has to endure, because conditions are very rigid, and they have been very stern on the conditions that Sri Lanka has to meet. How does President Ranil Wickremesinghe's government go about ensuring that these conditions are not too rigid for them, so as to ensure that there is no public opposition when it comes to these conditions? Or is it simply out of our hands? If the IMF gives us a condition, we have to implement it?
So with the IMF conditionality, initially there were questions where IMF would ask to reduce expenditure and that would affect the poor. But what we see is that later on IMF focuses on revenue enhancing measures and also social safety nets. So IMF is also concerned on protecting the poor and protecting the vulnerable, but IMF is more focused on revenue enhancing measures. So we need to also, as the government and as Sri Lanka, have a plan on how we are going to implement it. We can set conditions, we can set policies, but implementation is what matters. And we need to make sure that we have a plan on how we are going to meet those targets and how we can mitigate the spillover risks. So that is one way where we can look at and how the president can mitigate those risks. And like I said earlier, transparency could also greatly help in the IMF program.
Right, we are nearing the end of the program. However, Raj, I must ask you, there is a budget that will be presented in November, and that will be the budget for 2023. What sort of targets should the government strive for through this budget? How can financial allocations be made? What sort of industries, sectors should be prioritized? Should the social safety net be expanded more? What is your opinion on this?
So the November budget, I hope, would focus more on revenue enhancing measures and have revenue proposals. And like I said, instead of defaulting back, it focuses on new proposals that make sense for the current economic climate. We could also focus on social safety nets, but that are effectively targeted. Instead of following the same old Samurdhi, we can have new new targeting methods like the electricity pricing. We could also see expenditure reallocation focusing on education, health, and less priorities on highways and stuff like that. So maybe we see expenditure reallocation, effective targeting, and greater revenue enhancing measures.
Right. We were in conversation with Raj Prabu Rajakulendran, and an analyst attached to Verite Research. We were dissecting the budget amendment that was presented in Parliament yesterday, and we also discussed about the IMF, the prospects of the budget in November and whatnot. Thank you very much, Raj, for joining me this evening. However, we must now make way for the primetime news on TV1. As always, take care and good night.